now for the next 2 years the director of the IHS, and it is a true pleasure today to welcome Professor Anne Kelly Knowles and Levi Westerveld as our speakers. True pleasure to welcome them. Professor Knowles is McBride Professor of History and Graduate Coordinator at the University of Maine. He's been a leading figure in digital and spatial humanities for over 2 decades. She's written 2 books and edited 4. Within geography and historical GIS, historical geography, she's best known for her work in U.S. industrialization and on Welsh migration. She leapt to national attention, including references in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, around 2013 for her exacting reconstruction of the Battle of Gettysburg. Her careful examination of the topography and even the tree line of that battlefield allowed her to posit a new explanation for the disastrous miscommunication between Generals Lee and Longstreet, and also why Lee ordered disastrous Pickett's charge. But what I find so exciting about Anne's work is while she was, through those projects, realizing the maximum potential of conventional GIS, which of course relies on exact geospatial coordinates, she was also exploring what lay beyond conventional GIS. And today's presentation is a lot about what lies beyond conventional GIS. How can we map human experiences that don't have geospatial data? How can we map the fragmentary recollections of trauma survivors? And that new research, which is part of a long-standing collaboration between and so in my notes, I toggle between Professor Knowles and Anne. So yes, I thought they were both okay. We've gotten to know each other via Zoom. Between Anne and Levi, supported by both the National Science Foundation and the Guggenheim Foundation. And what I find especially powerful about Anne and Levi's intervention is that it's a critique of conventional GIS from inside. So this is not an argument that GIS is somehow bad. It's just that GIS is profoundly limited. And it's not a bad tool, it's just the wrong tool for massive parts of human experience. And Professor Knowles' partner in this new mapping project is Levi Westerveld. He's an award-winning cartographer with broad experience in spatial data gathering, analysis, and visualization. He's a senior engineer at the Norwegian Coastal Authority and also the lead editor and cartographer for the Nunatsiaq Arctic Permafrost Atlas. I learned that Nunatsiaq is, what do they speak in Greenland? Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So like Professor Knowles, Levi gracefully straddles 2 worlds. On the one hand, he helps realize the full potential of conventional GIS, while on the other, and Levi, I'll close here with a quote from you. On the other hand, on the other side, he's working on designing a new cartographic language to analyze and convey the experiences of Holocaust survivors. So with that intro, I'd like to turn Zoom and the floor over to Professor Knowles and Levi Westerveld.
Thanks so much, Mark. Levi and I are really delighted to be with you all today, and particularly to help launch a year of what sounds like fascinating programming, and to have more and more people interested in taking on the challenges of cartographic and map-like representations of human experience, I think, can only lead to more and more excellent solutions. And I'm also really a fan of the Institute for Historical Studies. I think those of us who do historical work, whether we call ourselves historians or historical geographers or any of many other labels, need to stand strong these days and support one another's work. I also want to give a shout out to a number of friends, including in the room there in Austin, Steve Holscher. We go way back, and I'm thrilled to be here today. And Paulette.
We're both a bit grayer than we were in Madison.
But we haven't lost our edge, right?
Right.
So again, thank you all. Levi and I are going to ping pong back and forth in our presentation, taking about equal time. Levi will start, and we look forward particularly to your questions and comments at the end. I will be driving, and so I will now share my screen. And ask Levi to take it away.
Great. Thank you. I'm joining you from a small town in southern Norway. Let me just set my screen here. I don't see the slides, but it's okay because I know what is on them. It's okay, and it's fine.
Okay.
So the title of our presentation is Loosening the Grid, Ideas for Mapping the Human Experience. And Mark gave a very good introduction to the problem we're going to be discussing today. And the grid we're talking about in the title of our presentation is really the Cartesian grid, the grid of latitude and longitude, the mathematical grid that is used as a framework for many of the maps that we see being produced today. And it's this grid that we are problematizing and seeking to distort to better fit another type of mapping that we think is very needed and important in the field of cartography. And the next slide, please, Anne. I thought before we start to diving into the topic of Holocaust, I wanted to give a few examples of some of my own work and share with you a little bit where I come from to this topic of Holocaust research. Here is a map from the forthcoming Arctic Permafrost Atlas. It shows the modeled decline in permafrost in extent for different global warming stabilization values. This is a type of map on the issue of climate change that many of you will have seen. These maps on these issues are prevalent in media, especially in the past few years due to the increase in extreme weather events. And these maps are very powerful to help us understand the issue that are taking place. In this particular case, I chose a projection that was well fitting to the data being shown. A color gradient that shows the projection of the potential decline in permafrost at different warming events in the future, and also a color that draws attention to the importance and problem of the issue. The map also has conventionally a legend, labels for the countries and for the communities in the Arctic for which these changes are important. A first order goal of these maps for us in the Atlas is to help a non-scientific audience and policymakers understand the issue of permafrost thaw and the link between permafrost thaw and climate change. However, for many of these maps in the Atlas, but also more generally on climate change, there is a second order of impact that we strive to achieve, which is a change in policy and regulation and in how we behave as communities to be able to have a more sustainable future. And whereas on this first order of clarifying and furthering the understanding of an issue, these maps are very powerful, they often fail dramatically at inspiring change at that second and higher level. And I would argue part of that is because they fail to connect with our imagination, our feelings, and our ability to put ourselves in the future that these maps are trying to present, and what this means for the human experience of people living in the Arctic and beyond. Second slide, please. The second topic I wanted to bring to your attention as a way to illustrate the problem that we're going to be diving into today's presentation is that of the crisis of migration taking place in the Mediterranean Sea. We have on the left side a map from the International Migration Organization, published in 2017, that shows, by showing circles, the events where people in boats capsized and died or went missing in the Mediterranean seas. The colors are used to evoke or to show the different years when these events took place. Location is shown in the Cartesian grid, and size depicts the number of people involved. The map clearly shows the scale, perhaps evoke the quantity and the number of individuals, as well as the geographic routes, the eastern, central, and western migration routes that these migrants are taking to reach European shores. Maps are very much visual communication products, just as the photograph you see on the right-hand side. This is a photo of a Syrian boy, 2 years old, Alan Kurdi, who was found on the Turkish shores as he was in one of these embarkations trying to reach the shores of Greece. Just as the map, the picture is trying to tell a story and tells a story. Where the map is helping me understand perhaps the scale and the geography of the issue, the picture to me brings me to think of my own daughter, the feeling of the parents in this situation, the fear in the boy as he was falling in the water and as he was drowning, and of course, profound sadness. This picture made the headlines of many big media organizations and traveled around the world, and is a picture that in our mind we still associate very much with this issue. Now, this picture brings up in me a much more stronger feeling. I'm able to project myself in the mind or the feeling of the parents and the loss of a child, and I'm able, it's a picture that for me evokes much more a willingness to engage with the topic. If we go back to the map fails to do so. And I think, yeah, I'll stop there, but I'll say that the map, I think too often as cartographers, we take for granted that the few variables we can work with in geographical representations are size, placement of labels, the type of data that we show, and colors, where in fact, I believe we have to rethink the entire framework, underlying framework. I also don't think that the maps are good at showing one type of data and pictures, dense writing are good at portraying and communicating a different type of data. I think there is room for creativity and innovation in the language of cartography for us to bring geographical representation of space closer and more inclusive to the human experiences, not only for communication, but also for analysis. Next slide, please. My first slide, before we dive into the Holocaust project, is an example of what loosening the grid can look like in a cartographic representation. Here we're showing the same North African countries. We're showing the geographic of the Mediterranean Sea. Scale, distance, and direction are distorted, but as a cartographer, I'm trying to place you in the shoes or in the boats of the migrants that we're hoping to see on the horizon, the coastlines of the destination countries of Spain, Italy, and Greece. Instead of putting all the migrants together in one big bubble for one event, I put them apart, having one dot per person. And I also give you small lines of blue text to engage with you in telling you a little bit more about some of the individual events and hopefully sparking some kind of imagination, trying to help you imagine what happened to the other circles for which less or no information is available on the map. So trying to give space in the map for imagination to help you connect better with your own feeling, experience, memories, and with the issue at hand. The map is not a true representation of geographical space, but perhaps a more true representation of the human experience in that geographical space. And I think this question of what is true in maps and geographic representation and what is distortion is one we're grappling with as well in our Holocaust research. And next to you, Anne.
Thank you, Levi. Just before we leave this remarkable image, something else that I find powerful in Levi's visual approach here is that the destinations in the upper part of, let's call it the map, are names and a kind of generalized view of the coast from the sea, which is, I think, first a masterful play on the intuition of reminding us that these people were at sea and trying to head to a distant shore. But because it is just the names and a sort of tiny distant outline. It also suggests the aspiration and not knowing, are we going to make it? It's almost just in their minds, in their eyes in the distance. So this map is evocative on so many levels, which is characteristic of Levi's approach. He never is solving a single problem, but thinking about many at once, which is one reason I find it so exciting to work with him. I began thinking about the Holocaust at a time when I had no background at all in Holocaust studies, Holocaust history, or geography, when I was called by the Holocaust Museum and asked a fateful question, as it turned out: did I think GIS might be useful for studying the Holocaust? And the context at the time, back in around 2005, I think, was that the Holocaust Museum was about to inherit an enormous tranche of documents in the millions from the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, Germany. And many of those documents had geographic information attached of some sort. So someone in the museum's research center thought that GIS could help researchers manage this huge amount of information. That led to a series of discussions, including Alberto Giordano centrally. Hello, Alberto. He is present with us virtually today. And a workshop that we organized with an interdisciplinary group of historians and geographers from many branches of our respective disciplines in 2007. The map that is on the screen today reflects one of the scales of the implementation, one of the geographic scales of the implementation of the Holocaust that our group quickly decided to focus on. This was, in fact, Alberto's idea. In addition to taking this fundamentally geographical approach to studying the Holocaust from the continental scale of the SS camps represented here down to the individual scale of bodies, we also wanted to see what kind of geographic methods could be useful for studying the Holocaust, including GIS, with which several of us were familiar and well practiced. As Levi said, GIS can be incredibly useful for pulling together a great deal of information, for displaying it in many different ways. This is only one of many permutations in our book, Geographies of the Holocaust, of the same data, and for thinking about spatial patterns at all possible scales. Doing what I think of as empirical mapping, in this case, tracing the outline of architectural plans from part of Auschwitz, Auschwitz I here, is also an excellent way to ground historical research in the actual physical circumstances of whatever event and place one is studying. But this illustration, this map, also reveals another important way in which GIS can be useful. Here, the plans that Nazi architects and site managers had for adding buildings in orange, including wonderful new housing for SS guards and a grand pavilion to greet visitors to this future capital of the Reich in the upper left-hand corner. The orange showing these were in the plans but were never built. Instead, the Germans had other priorities in 1942 and 43 and 44 for Auschwitz, which affected what happened on the ground. So in keeping with the theme that we're going to be developing of visualizing what people were thinking as well as what happened on the ground, this map actually contrasts Nazi plans and the contingencies of war and genocide. The discontent that the members of our research group, who came to call ourselves the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative, crystallized around the joint project looking at testimonies of a number of women who survived evacuations out of Auschwitz. And for me, it really came to focus on this particular map, beautifully made, following all the best cartographic conventions of intended and actual routes of evacuation out of Auschwitz and a number of its daughter camps in January 1945. The problem is, if you look at this map honestly, it shows direction and likely routes on the ground. It does not actually show people, except at the extremely abstract, generalized level of the size of a graduated circle. When we showed this map, and I've shown these graphics many times, a common complaint is, where are the people? And this began to push me in 2012, 13, 14, and in 13, 14, Levi and I began to collaborate to confront the limits of GIS, what I've come to think of as the demands of coordinate geography, as well as the demands of representing time in cartography, which can be equally reductive or so overgeneralized that you lose a great deal of richness and specificity. So turning to testimony was a major change in my research agenda and was the sort of beginning of this very rich collaboration with Levi. How did victimized individuals and groups respond to perpetrator actions? Most of our studies in the book had been based on perpetrator documents and actions. And the work that we began to undertake was part of a much larger turn in Holocaust studies, which many refer to as the turn to testimony, making use of tens of thousands of recorded oral histories with Holocaust survivors, primarily at the major Holocaust archives around the world. But the approach that we took in the summer of 2014, and here all credit goes to Levi and our other student collaborator, Laura Strom, was to step away from the computers, not to build another database, but to listen to testimony over and over and work by hand, pencil and crayon and marker on paper, on chalkboards, and you'll see in a moment, even with physical models, to begin to think what spatial evidence is contained within this testimony. This is one of Laura's early drawings of one man's account using red and green to indicate his relative sense as he told his stories of freedom of movement in green, like when he was able to go home from a camp, and constriction and constraint in red. And this story bubble drawing, I love to encourage students to forget about doing what's proper and think about what they're actually seeing in the material, or hearing in this case as well. These story bubbles were Laura's revelation that many of Leon Wells' most extended narratives, which came like bubbles within a recitative of events, were at a tiny little place, sometimes even just a room. And this, I quickly realized, was a pattern within many testimonies. Levi became fascinated, particularly by the structure of these narratives. This is his physical model using pins on styrofoam board with different colored threads of the people and the groups coming in and out of one woman's testimony. I came back from my honeymoon to find this on the GIS room table, and it was another kind of revelation, a new way of thinking about the material that again revealed structure. And then this came out of all of that exploration in the summer, a schematic diagram of how time works in testimony. That time is elastic, it's like an accordion, and someone giving an account of their experiences may cover a great deal of historical time in just a minute or two of testimony, and then the important events are what expand time and provide much more detail, emotion, commentary, observation, and so forth. This led Levi and me to think, oh, there's a lot going on here. We could do much more. And we decided to look at another pair of testimonies, Anna Laxpatipa and Jakob Brodman, whose testimonies I had from a couple different Holocaust archives. They happened to grow up on either side of the Carpathian Mountains, but it was really the geographic richness of their testimony that drew us to them. And I'm going to play just 1 minute from Anna's interview with the San Francisco Jewish Holocaust Center.
I'm Howard Felsen with the Holocaust Oral History Project, and we're at Beth Jacobs Synagogue in Thursday, February 23rd, 1989. We're in Oakland, California, speaking with Anna Patipa. Could you tell us your name and where you were born?
My name is Anna Patipa. My maiden name was Lax, and I was born in Perečin, the eastern part of Czechoslovakia.
When?
In 1923, September 1923.
And what was your family like then?
My family, my parents had a well-established business, and I was the youngest of 5 children.
What could Levi and I bring through a more systematic approach to preserve and analyze the experiences of people like Anna Patipa? Levi?
We started watching the videos of the testimonies, but also reading again and again through the transcripts in English. Here it shows 2 pages of the transcripts with the questions and the answers from Anna Patipa. In yellow, you see we started highlighting mentions of places and space and geography throughout the testimony, and we did this both for Anna Patipa and Jakob Brotman. And I think, as all of you, perhaps in some dimension are thinking or working with maps, we really focused on trying to come to an understanding of what it is that we wanted to map rather than what can be mapped. So we focused on the why first before thinking about the how, which was a very freeing approach to the visualization and the reading process. What we realized quite fast, I think, already in our previous research, and this was strengthened in this project, was that the spaces and the places and the geography that mattered most to these individuals were the places in which their senses were available to build experience and memory. What I mean by that is that we humans use our eyes to see, or our ears to hear, our hands and our bodies to touch, our nose to smell, to experience the landscape in which we live. And that is where our strongest memories are created. The memories of Anna Patipa, of her hometown, don't happen in the town. They happen in her bedroom, they happen by the farmers, the neighbors, they happen in the fields, in places where she can experience with her senses. And our ultimate question was, if these places are so important, how can we bring them to light in a new cartographic framework that allow both for the analysis of these places, comparison of these types of places between different survivors, but also for the visualization and communication of these places to our audiences. Next slide, please. One way to think about these mentions of places is to try to place them along 2 scales. And there are a number of variables we could try to place these mentions of places in, but I think 2 important ones that I think underscore the importance of being inclusive in our approach to geography was scale and specificity. Scale, of course, is a very important concept for geographers. And what we saw in the testimonies was that the survivors would talk about very large spaces, the woods or Auschwitz, and they would also talk about very, very specific spaces. They might talk about something they were hiding in their pockets, in their pants, about the stake or location outside the barrack. At the same time, there was a concept of specificity. where some places were extremely specific, again, like a specific town, and other places were more abstract, more blurry, perhaps because the memory was not clear, or the time spent in a place was less long, or the person was less known with that geography or that space. And by recording these places, and we recorded 251 mentions of place for Anapatipa and 377 for Botman, we saw that fewer of these places were specific and big enough to be mapped, actually very few of them. And most of these spaces were either vague or small, and didn't have the latitude and the longitude attributes available for us to work with them in a conventional GIS. Next slide, please. And so we started really grappling with how can we work with this data in a meaningful way. And we have countless examples, I think, of sensitive cartography throughout history, of people that are stepping away from the Cartesian grid to create representations of space that are inclusive to all types of geographical data. But the issue really arises when one tries to scale and systemize that visualization to allow also for analysis and for a methodological development to different types of data sets. To try to find an answer to this problem, we turned to a field of mathematics called topology, which is interested with the relationship between places in terms of relative to one another rather than on a Cartesian grid. Here you see 7 examples of topological relationships between two places. Place A can be inside B, outside, can intersect, it can be adjacent and inside, outside and adjacent, inside and share a boundary, or outside and share a boundary. Here we talk about relationships. We're not concerned about the scale of A or B, the distance between A or B, or the direction between these places, but we're concerned about the location. Was the bedroom inside their house or inside the friend's house? Was a cemetery inside the town or outside the town? Was the work area inside Auschwitz or outside or inside the camp? Next slide, please. And here's an example, very simply, how a language, a sentence in plain English language that is very rich in geographical information, but very few information on latitude and longitude, can be mapped in a topological space. So if we take the sentence, I sit in front of a desk in a barn on the coast of Maine, we of course are able to find geographical information for Maine and for the coast. But if we don't know the location of that barn, the location of the desk inside that barn, we're not able to place those important elements that tell a story about I and the human body in that space. But if we think about these places in terms of topological relationships, we can say that the I, the body, is in front and adjacent and outside, but close to the desk. And that the desk and the body are inside the barn. Similarly, the barn is inside or on the coast of Maine, and the coast of Maine is part of Maine and that space. And here we've actually developed a systematic way to map these dimensions of places that allow us to create a framework that can be scaled to many more places. Next slide, please. So taking this approach, we went back to our list of mentions of places in the 2 testimonies and started first in the Cartesian grid to map only the places we had coordinates for. And you see from the few hundreds we had, there were very few for which we were actually able to place in the real geography. Next slide, please. We then expanded these locations because these were often big cities, big camps. And already here, by expanding their space to give space to the smaller places that were mentioned in them, we're distorting the grid and we're giving room to the importance and dimensions of the places that were important in the testimonies. Then working through the data, we started adding the other smaller places based on their topological relationship to the main anchor points in that geographical landscape. And bit by bit, next slide, please, we started kind of developing the visual language and also adding data to the map. And you see here, if you were looking at the map of Europe, and at these places, it would make sense in terms of relative location, east and west, north and south. But at the same time, you'll see in some of the next pictures that when we zoom in, we really have given space for the smaller places to shine and to be prevalent in the visual representation. Next slide, please. In this process of creating a map of the geographies and experiences of Anna Patipa and Jakob Rothman, we also wanted to make clear and apparent the presence of the cartographer as a producer of this, as a participant in the communication process that happens between the interpretation of the testimonies and the viewers or the audience of our maps. We did so by bringing in the hand of the cartographer and through using charcoal and drawing on paper these different places. This enabled us to make each place unique in the sense that the digital footprint, which was a scan of the charcoal circle, was unique for each place, where every place had their own line. And it also allowed us again to kind of hint to the reader that there's somebody behind that, and try to not abstract it in these perfect circular lines and circles that we tend to see in GIS designed maps. And so here you see the different categories that we try to organize or mentions of places in. Everything from this little cross to mention a very, very specific but quite small place that was often very important in the testimony, a pocket, a window, or a fire. Then we have room-sized places like a bedroom, a cattle car, houses-sized places, a barrack, a synagogue, buildings. Then we have slightly bigger infrastructure, a factory, a train station, an agglomeration of buildings that form a sub-camp or a small ghetto or a village. Then we have these more vague, abstract spaces that are all quite important, and often these are natural landscape, like a forest or a hill. And then we have these larger spaces like a city or a larger camp. Next slide, please. And this is the final map, which is 2 meters wide and 1 meter high, that shows the story and the geography of the two survivors using 2 different colors, yellow for Anna Patipa and green for Jakob Rothman. And we also used opacity based on a number of times a place was mentioned. So some places were mentioned very frequently, perhaps drawing attention to the importance of a place and are more opaque. And some places were mentioned only once and are much more transparent in our map. We have a few slides here, a couple of slides here where we zoom in. First into Peresin, which is the town where Anna Patipa grew up. And here you note some details. For example, you see a lot is happening in her house, and she talks very distinctively about the geography of her house, the different bedrooms, the people that came to occupy her house. And you understand that space, that small space, is very important in her story and in her memories of the changes that took place during the Holocaust. And then you see some of the other places that were important to her in that town, both inside and outside the town. We chose to include some extracts of the testimonies to give a qualitative and a deeper understanding of the geography through the stories being told there. And you see there that by highlighting in bold the places we're trying to connect the text to the visualization in the map. The numbers that are linked to these section of the transcript help us tell the chronological order and the progression and the movement of the survivors through space. Here we're looking at Auschwitz, which is mentioned both by Anna Patipa and Jakob Rothman in the testimonies. And if you start reading some of the names of the places, you really start understanding, I think, the type of places that their memories are anchored in. You see the kitchens, the showers, the barracks, the cabins, a big room, doors, fires, different camps. And it gives a sense of the scale, the complexity of the geography, but also the types of spaces that they were engaging in. So I think here we have demonstrated that we're able to develop a framework to systematically visualize these mentions of places. And I think this framework also, I think, demonstrates the potential for scalability, which is an important issue for geographer, but also for analysis, where you can start querying this data organized topologically to ask, for example, all mentions of one type of place, for example, a small place inside a forest. So one can use this framework to actually start running the type of spatial quiz that one would do in a GIS, but be much more inclusive to the places that are important for these survivors. I want to end my part of the presentation by drawing your attention to a project where we've really built on this framework of topological mapping in the context here, working with Sami reindeer herders in northern Norway and northern Sweden. The Sami reindeer herders are still migrating throughout the year with their herds, and they have in the last few decades faced extreme challenges, both because of climate change and changes in the landscape, but also increase in infrastructure such as mine, windmills, and roads and railways in the Arctic region. Oftentimes, these Sami reindeer herders are invited to participate and to provide their knowledge and their experiences in conventional maps to help planners and government agencies to try to take into account their use of the landscape and plan for it. But oftentimes, when they're forced to kind of fit the complexity of their knowledge and their migration routes in time in these conventional GIS maps, they're obliged to omit and massage that knowledge to fit this framework, which is often too rigid to fit the complexity of their use of space. And so, next slide, please. This has actually been a very successful project and an example of taking this approach of topological mapping, where we have co-produced knowledge with these communities, asking them to draw, for example, their summer pastures, their calving grounds, their winter pastures, and then starting to draw on top of that the different types of infrastructures and impacts of climate change on these spaces. We did not find important exactly where the mine was located on the map, but what was much more important was wherever the map was located inside the calving grounds or outside the calving grounds and the relationships between these spaces. And so this, for them, was a much freeing approach to mapping their geographies, both for analysis, but also as a tool for communication to different stakeholders. So this is an example of how this topological mapping that was developed in the Holocaust has been useful in other research and work as well. And yes.
Thanks, Levi. Levi's approach, our approach to places, thinking about the places where important events happened and the places that hold memories, equally important, has shaped my ongoing work as well. I'm now working with a team of scholars and students, undergraduate and graduate at the University of Maine, Duke, and Columbia to build a beta website, a public website, to share and link information about more than 2,200 SS camps and Jewish ghettos with nearly 1,000 survivor testimonies. While this work has brought me up another steep incline of learning into corpus linguistics, natural language processing, machine learning, artificial intelligence, in order to scale, what we are scaling up from are the inductive visualization and spatial insights that first came up in my work with Levi, namely that mapping and coding named places in testimony is certainly fundamental. And I have examples of 3 of our named categories on the left part of this slide. But our real goal, our biggest goal, and by far the biggest challenge for corpus and computational linguistics is how to identify, analyze, and eventually visualize unnamed and non-coordinate places, We are working now with 5 categories, which we went through a great deal of development of training data with manual coding of testimonies, more than a year of discussion of where different terms should fall, now running it through machine learning to be able to code or to categorize mentions of thousands of place terms in testimony, almost none of which in this unnamed category have been tagged in other transcript data sets, such as the USC Shoah Foundation's archive of nearly 64,000 interviews. They tag all of the named places, but very few of the unnamed places. And I am particularly interested out of this list on the left in the interior spaces where people were able to preserve parts of their family life, their religious life, a bit of secrecy, a bit of privacy, the spaces that were often the last to be violated and the most violent kind of violation when they were stolen away or broken in upon. The importance of spatial objects, beginning with vehicles, cars, trucks, but also train cars, which have become a really important focus of humanistic study in Holocaust studies, because what happened inside the train cars, even more than being on a train per se, fundamentally changed people's lives and self-perception and so on. What you see on the right part of the screen here is our very first prototype for linguistic queries of our testimony data. So people will be able to query text freely, that is, put in any word they would hope to find material about, and the place categories, which are listed at the left. And through iterative exploration, we hope that people will be able to find out more and more about the places in which Holocaust events happened and how they were perceived by the survivors whose accounts these transcripts record. But this is less than half of the project, because the other side, which we have modeled initially, some of you may recognize this format, in ArcGIS Online, is GIS-based data about camps and ghettos, about 1,100 of each. Our data source is the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's authoritative encyclopedia, Volume 1 on SS camps, Volume 2 on ghettos in German-occupied Eastern Europe. Each of these large data sets has scores of categories or variables of data, which we extracted manually. This has taken us years. We're doing it very carefully, very slowly, with a great deal of discussion, with proofing, with the involvement of senior scholars in Holocaust studies to make sure that we don't distort the history any more than it has been by the prisms of memory and partial recording. Some very preliminary results will enable me to suggest how we hope the two sides, the GIS and the testimonies, will communicate and integrate. One basic question: what kind of physical enclosure did ghettos have? As it turns out, according to the encyclopedia, only a handful of ghettos had walls, which is what many people assume they must have had. Far, far more, 10 times more, were enclosed by barbed wire. What we can do as we develop the two sides of our website is that people will be able to go over to testimony now and ask, what did people say about barbed wire? And what are those, where were those experiences? Were they in a number of ghettos, in a single ghetto? Were they viewing from the outside or the inside, and so on? So what we want to set up is a dialogue between the places of experience and the places as recorded largely in perpetrator data. And this also gets at a long-term goal in Holocaust studies that many scholars have worked on for 20 years or more, to try to integrate victim and perpetrator histories. And Alberto and I and other members of the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative think that places, the points of intersection where perpetrators and victims were together, is a promising way to do that. I've mentioned time a couple times, so I just wanted to bring this in. Time has become one of the most important parts of our geospatial data. We did not expect this, but because the encyclopedia provides so much information, as here represented, when did Germans occupy a site and how long did a ghetto exist? Comparing regions, Western Poland on the left and Lithuania on the right, provides crucial context, historical, temporal, and ultimately personal context to understand and begin to imagine more deeply what were people able to do, not able to do, what were the possibilities, the chances for survival in a place that existed for 2 years versus 2 weeks. And this is our last slide, a kind of summary of much of our thinking, though not all of it so far, for expanding cartographic language. So this does not entirely record some of the systematic ideas that Levi was talking about, but a little bit that in cartographic convention, topography governs the underlying grid with a mathematical grid with reliable scale and so on, whereas we're really interested in topology, relative spatialities, the experience of everyday life, how we remember proximity, intensity, safety, danger, and so on. And with that, we very much welcome your comments and questions.
A lot in chat. Do we have any questions from here? Yes.
Can I just speak?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I studied the Tiananmen massacre in 1989 Tiananmen, and I spent the past 20 years. I think this is so inspiring and helpful because I can memorize every single detail of the testimony from the Tiananmen mothers. So we managed to put together one map where the location where the bodies were found, and another map where the people were killed. So it's totally different location. But I never figured out how to put together all these details that we had. And also over the years, because of the government's repression, people did not dare to come up. So I kept having these details. Like one person told me, I took this 10-year-old boy to the hospital, died, and no one never know where the parents is. So I do not know where to put this thing. So I think this mapping the details, I will be able to do so much with the testimony that I already got from the Tiananmen mothers. Thank you so much for, and if there's any suggestions that you can give or advice about this, I would appreciate that too.
I didn't offer at the top, but Mark, I'd be very happy to send copies of our 2 key articles, which we mentioned kind of in passing, inductive visualization and loosening the grid, and also the website link for our map. I was there, which is freely available online. So those are at least, those have many more ideas than we had time to talk about today and may help you further, I hope.
Well, and also Anne and Levi, we will bring them back in the spring, February. I should have memorized the date, but it's on the website, which is there, for a workshop for developing projects here that build on topology rather than topography. So here's the exact comment I was hoping for when we set it up that way, that people would have their own research projects that have these sort of traditional GIS coordinates, but then so much more data that doesn't fit. So thank you. So we'll see you in February. That's perfect. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm off camera, but thank you so much for your talk. It was really fantastic. I'm curious to hear, how long does it take to go from transcript to kind of mapping? Like, what does that, how long is it, like, how long did it take to take one of those interviews from a Holocaust survivor to then visualizing it in a way that you all showed us?
Well, it was kind of in two stages, wasn't it, Levi?
Yes. And I would say in general, in my experience in the production of maps, what takes the longest time is to figure out the visualization aspect. Because when you change a color or you change a font, often you put out of balance your initial idea and you have to change other elements. So there's a constant balancing out and trying to figure out how your visual progresses. And that is really what takes time, is to finding solutions to visual problems. But once you have figured out your system, then applying that system at scale and redoing it for other similar data sets goes much faster. So if you knew exactly what data you are looking for and how you're going to represent it, you could produce this map in a day. But if you're starting with a blank page and no clear idea yet or answer, then as for us, it took many weeks. So it's all about how far you are along figuring out your visual answers to your geographical problem.
I think it also depends on what your goal is. Are you trying to produce a map for publication? Are you trying to figure out a spatial problem or understand the geographic content of a source? I strongly encourage people to use the kind of inductive visualizations, the freehand sketches and note-taking and so on, whether they're going to publish it or not, because it helps you think. So there's some really excellent work coming out in spatial history these days by people who haven't made a single map, but they've used some of these methods to understand their sources better.
We have a question via Zoom. Is it Pascal? Pascal Boss?
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm here in the same awesome heat as everybody else is. So yeah, very, very interesting presentation. I'm very excited to hear that the two of you were doing the presentation here at the IHS. So I'm a Holocaust scholar who primarily works on different forms of testimony. And I've thought about mapping quite a bit because there's actually a project for which I'm thinking that I would like to use it. So I am puzzling over something. I was already puzzling over it, but even after your presentation, I'm still puzzling over it, which is what is ultimately, what is it that we are trying to make visible? So what story are we trying to tell? How and why? And is the picture telling a story, right? So Levi, you started with this very compelling, these visuals of like, well, here we have a map and it doesn't really allow us to connect to the human suffering. And then you showed some other forms of visualization that allow us to perhaps get in touch with that more. At the same time, you also juxtapose it with a photo, which, as you point out, is extremely effective in getting that sort of identification and sort of sense of it could have been us or it could have been my child or my grandchild across. So I feel a little bit the same way about certain kinds of statistics. They're incredibly important in my teaching. I also constantly use maps myself in my teaching on the Holocaust. But just like the statistics don't themselves tell a story, the maps also themselves don't tell a story. I always find myself using one of the maps from the museum or on the other publications and always adding all sorts of stuff onto it before I put it in the reader. So I, on some level, am still a little bit skeptical that the maps themselves can tell any story that a survivor testimony, whether it's audiovisual or written, can't more effectively convey. I mean, they're doing different things. I'm not disagreeing. So isn't it perhaps useful to think about maps as another aspect of that history? Okay, so what I'm trying to say is, are we teasing that out by way of the maps? Or are we hoping that the audience will tease that out by way of the maps. And I'm not sure that the audience can always do that by way of the map. So aren't we still obliged to tell the story, maybe in addition to the map? Something like that. Those are some of my questions.
I don't think any map speaks for itself. I don't think any painting speaks for itself. It's a common thing now for people to say every map tells a story, just as we used to say every picture tells a story. I was recently in Italy. I hate Baroque art because I don't understand it. I don't know what the garb and the postures and the doves and the rest symbolize. Levi was speaking of cartographic language, but I think it always needs to be explained. And conversely, while text and narrative are almost inseparable, at least text is the mode of narrative, or words are the mode of narrative. But narratives, infamously to geographers, omit space. So from as basic as how far did someone travel to how long did they stay in a place to what was the weather like in that place when they were there, many aspects of geographic experience are omitted in the interest of telling a story in relation, especially in history, to historical events. And I find that kind of writing also problematic because of what it omits. Levi?
I've been grappling with what you're mentioning a lot, and I was hoping, part of me hoped somewhere, is it possible for us as humans to take in more feelings and emotion at scale? Like that picture of the boy and the beach, is it possible to scale that in the same way that maps are able to scale information? I think the answer to that is no, because often when you go along the scale axis and the more data you're bringing into your visual, the more simplification is needed to be able to absorb and understand that data. However, in the process of simplifying larger amounts of data, you're making choices about what elements and facets of your data you want to bring forward in your simplification process. And this is where I think that we can push the relationship between the amount of data and the simplification away from the standard answers that cartography have been given us towards pushing them slightly more towards different types of understanding of the data that focuses more on the human experience. And by doing so, we might be able to balance the scale a little bit more towards understanding at scale the human experience in a geographical landscape.
This is something Levi and I will be working on next. I'm working in the early stages of developing an atlas of the Holocaust that focuses on 12 geographical themes. And he and I are going to try to figure out how to represent mass murder.
We have another question. Oh, I'm sorry, Levi, did you want to speak more? So Alberto via Zoom, would you like to chime in?
Yes, hi, and hi, Levi. The point that Pascal just made, it's a good one, and Levi, you know that I've been interested in this for a long time. But so the question I'm interested in is, how do you scale up? How do you go from the beautiful representation of that you did of Anna? How do you scale up that? And so, in text and in narratives, in text analysis, you have corpus linguistics. In the representation of geographical data, you have GIS. I don't think we have something like that for cartographic representation that is not based on absolute space, but it's based on relative space and on the vague geographies that you talked about. I've been working on that, as you know, and for quite some time. And but some ideas we are doing with Tim Cole, and knows very well. We are writing something at the representation of emotions taken from Holocaust narratives. So my question to Anne and Levi is, how do you think we can scale up from 1 or 2 or 3 to, I wouldn't say 1,000, but to 10? And Levi already hinted at some things in your answer, Levi, which is, well, you need to choose what aspects, what attributes of the testimony you're representing. And so, what direction do you think us going in the direction of scaling up from 1 or 2 or 3 to many? And what kind of research question do you think the scaling up from a cartographic point of view can help us answer? Thank you.
Levi, you want to start?
Yeah, I think sort of my dream is that 5 years from now, we have ArcGIS, we have QGIS, and we have a new type of geographical software that allow us to systematically map and also run analytical queries on data that is organized topologically. And I think perhaps this is where Anne's work in the last slides is going to, and some of her trying to combine the geographical information on ghettos and camps with survivor testimonies. But here's a slide that breaks down a little bit the vision for that, where the inputs for our I Was There map were mentions of places and attributes for those places. So what type of places were they? How did the people feel in those places? And then the relationships, the topological relationships. So you can think of 2 distinct tables that when combined allow us to kind of present some kind of topological network where the circles represent places and the links represent the relationships between these places. Now it's possible through software to systematically go from a network of relationships to this visual I mentioned with, for example, the example from I was sitting in front of a desk on the coast, in a barn on the coast of Maine. And these places and organized topologically can be anchored to a Cartesian grid for the places for which we know that. And still respecting their topological relationships. This is what we have done with I Was There. If you do this at scale in a new imaginative software, you could start asking questions to your data. And this is what Anne showed us she's already doing with the example of the barbed wires and the mention of testimonies. You could start asking in all testimonies of survivors coming from this part of Czechoslovakia between this time period in that camp, what types of places did they mention that are of size of the very small size and the pocket size, or what were the places they mentioned were outside of the camp? So what are places that they're related to that were outside of the camp when they were inside of the camp? And so I think the answer is not towards the visualization as an end product, but more towards producing a platform or framework that allows for questioning the data and producing at scale different visualizations that are answering different types of questions, which would be, I think, a very powerful tool to gain new insight and as a tool for discovery into the testimonies, which is very difficult at the moment unless you're reading yourself through many testimonies and keeping record of the geographical findings. But yeah.
Can I add one kind of research question, Levi, that I'm hopeful, Alberto, our new system will help me investigate. I have a conviction, I guess, that places are fundamentally important to human well-being, identity, awareness, and sense of mastery or control, and that the Holocaust, and particularly the material in Holocaust testimonies, offers us extraordinary insight into what happens to people, what new kinds of horrendous difficulties they face when they are denied place, when they are ripped from their places, when they become disoriented, dislocated, and so on. The loss of place is a huge part, or was a huge part of Holocaust experience. I would like to use linguistically coded testimonies to test that conviction through seeing, in the first instance, how does language about place change? Does it always become impoverished with fewer and fewer nouns, with fewer and fewer adjectives? Levi referred to the richness of Anapatipa's description of the places of her home. Do references to place become more abstract, more universal, the longer people are going through the tribulations and dislocations in camps and ghettos? So that's one example. I don't know what kind of visual that would produce, but I hope Levi will help me find it.
Thank you.
I don't see any questions via Zoom, so I'm going to chime in. First, Levi and Anne, that was simply fantastic, and I guess to overshare as a data nerd and the child of Holocaust survivors, I find it perhaps particularly affecting, but it's just an incredibly powerful presentation. Pascal's comment reminded me of sort of the problem of how a lot gets lost in any synthesis at grander scale, and it reminded me perhaps darkly of the possibly apocryphal quote from Stalin: "A single death is a tragedy and a million are a statistic." And he certainly wasn't talking about conventional GIS. He was talking about what happens when we try and grapple with things at scale. And I guess GIS conventionally is just a single instance of that loss of immediacy when we scale things up. It does, for me, then bring up a few questions. By the way, I find this work fantastic, is the ability perhaps to toggle between scales. If we find this, can we link it to the original testimony? Which again, so we can move up and down in scales as researchers, but then as readers. And then I'm asking that question, but I guess I want to immediately flag is that we consider maps this intervention, but it's not as though testimony is somehow raw. We don't have some transparent lens into immediate human experience. Those testimonies are done in a place, in a time. There's a single interviewer. They're done with a person at a certain age, a certain number of years away from an immediate experience. They can be interviewed in a group as an individual. We can have video or not. It can be written. So it's not as though we have, oh, here's the truth of the experience. It's all mediated in different ways. And I guess what I'm excited about, what makes me so excited about your work is the explicitness of how the goals of your intervention and the methodology of your intervention are foregrounded rather than hidden the way they are in conventional GIS. But then, so yes, that's why I like it so much. Thanks for presenting today. But also, can we to some degree give the researcher and the viewer the option of multiple levels of scale and multiple levels of analysis and mediation? So that's the actual question.
Yeah, and iteration, and I'm thinking of Pascal's question as really a bundle of questions which are provocative and will stay with me. The most people who read history or read about the Holocaust are interested in the people involved and the stories of what happened. Foregrounding methods can be a buzzkill for people who, want maybe what they would say is the real stuff, the human stuff. So another aspect of our collaboration, I think, is an awareness that we want, or a goal that we want to be very transparent about method and share it with others and have it critiqued and critique it ourselves, but that we're also ultimately interested in how we're communicating understanding, whether that is actually an historical narrative or something else.
I really like the comment on scale. I think scale also opens up for imagination on the side of the reader, where connecting a scale at which the reader is able to connect with, that means where the senses of the experience of the survivor, something the survivor has seen, has heard, or has felt, the reader of the map is able to in their brain to conceive of those senses and imagine those, and then taking that experience of the reader of the map and then scale it up to kind of make sense of that across a much larger area or larger amount of data is a very powerful solution. And I think this underscores as well the importance of taking into account the audience as where really, if you produce a map for communication, the communication happens in the head of the audience. And I think too often, and myself included, I take for granted and assume what the reader of the map is going to feel or is going to understand when they see a map I may have made. And I think also, one direction I think is interesting to go into is to start interacting with the audience as the map is being produced and start questioning the audience, the effects, first having a clear understanding of what are the effects and the goals that we want to do, because often that is not even clear from our side as cartographers and producer of maps. And then are the intended effects of our maps being achieved by questioning the readers? What are you seeing in this map? What is it evoking? How do you feel, or what do you understand from the map? I think having that dialogue with an audience can also be a very interesting way to further the development of the cartographic language.
Let me follow up on that, because in opening it up that way, I guess the challenge for any researcher or any author is, are we willing to let readers or users basically get lost or go to places we didn't expect? And even your bold new cartography has a certain fixedness to it. And when you open that up and allow viewers to play at scale and perhaps wander through something that's that much denser, that's very exciting, also really challenging. And to what degree is that unexpectedness something we should be ready for and embrace and empower?
Oh, that's no problem at all. Bring it on. Bring it on. I have not yet done this, but I have imagined for years a kind of theatrical production that would include animation within a stage, or presenting work, including map animations, which we didn't show you, but the Holocaust Geographies Project has quite a number now. Animations in a planetarium setting, voiceovers, not to hype it, but precisely to bring more emotion, more humanity into the images. I think we're so used to just thinking of maps as something stuck on a page or now static on a screen. There are as many possibilities for presenting spatial understanding and spatial graphics as there are for any other mode of communication.
You have a question?
I do.
We have a question from a student who read your essay in my class last year. So how's that?
Yeah, and at the same time, I also took a class with Dr. Wittgenstein, who's down at the party. But yeah, I also took a class on the history of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe as well. So one of the questions I had is when I was listening to this talk, which was really great, thank you. how do we exactly map traumatic experiences? Because I think when it gets into the mapping traumatic experiences, the reliability of memory comes into play because, for example, if we are dealing with testimony, memory is very potent and we can remember a lot, but we also forget a great deal and we repress a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just, for example, like we associate colors with something, or we associate sounds with something, or we associate sounds, and also just sight in general. And whenever any of our senses are just distorted, our memory also becomes distorted and our testimonies become distorted. So I'm just curious if how you are thinking about that going forwards in your collaborative project, because I think not just speaking in the Holocaust project in general, but if you want to map any sort of memory, it's
I'm curious what is the yardstick for value or purpose? And I don't mean like don't you think testimony is important? Clearly you do. But I'm thinking of the anxiety and the hesitancy among one of the great Holocaust historians, Christopher Browning, to base a book on testimony. Have you read his Remembering Survival by chance?
I've not.
Oh, okay, well, he one of the great Holocaust historians who specialized in Nazi policy and military policy and just right at the very top of the profession. And he finally decided in the late 2000s that he had to grapple with precisely the problems you're identifying. That testimony, just as the judges did at Nuremberg and didn't allow any testimonies from survivors, not that they were called that then, nor were any Jews allowed to give testimony about what they witnessed until the Eichmann trial in 1961, because as police know, eyewitness testimony is subjective, prone to exaggeration or omission, and all of that is absolutely true. So the reason I ask about value is, I think the more useful question is, what can testimony tell you that other kinds of sources can't? What Levi and I have focused on is just one of the many possible answers to that, which is how do they speak of place, and what role do places play as holders of experience? I would contend it's impossible to remember something that's happened to you without also remembering where it happened. So remembering where something happened or seeing that in testimony can add some dimensions that just looking at the events won't give you. That's a partial answer to your question.
I think that answers it too. Thank you.
Thank you. We're coming up on our 1:30 stop, and people have to go to class and teaching. But Pascal, I didn't want to end without, since you raised a question that really shaped so much of our discussion. If you'd like to chime in, please do.
Yeah, I'm still sort of grappling with we can't represent the thing. There's too many experiences, too many places. It is huge. I really appreciate what your aspect of mapping does, which is it does not just focus on time, it focuses on space and ideally time, and tries to bring in all these experiences. But the moment you're starting to talk about, let's say, well, I wish, or I imagine maybe I would represent, present it in a theater and then with voices, at that point I'm thinking, but then why not film?
Sure.
So no, but I mean, film does so many of these things. So of course I'm thinking about Landsman's Shoah the entire time. So the one thing I wonder if you can give me a short answer, what is the added value? And I have some ideas, but I wonder if you have some ideas, either one of you, what, for example, proximity or distance in space on a map adds to the audience in their understanding. So I think it only adds something if I tell a story about that proximity or that distance or the back and forth and all that. So that's still what I'm struggling with. It's like, what's the added value if I do all that work to also map it? So it's just kind of a challenge. Here's a challenge question.
The places would not be highlighted by anyone I know except Hanapol and Gallet if we hadn't started mapping them. I think most scholars, in history anyway, don't consider place seriously except as a bit of a stage set. They don't think about how spatial circumstances could fundamentally affect people's opportunities, limitations, responses, and so much more. Levi, what's your short answer?
I think you can, unveiling trends in your data along the lines of geographical experience that are invisible if you look at one or two testimonies alone, but that become visible when you look at many testimonies and start questioning those testimonies based on their geography. And I think those trends are an insight into the experience of the geographical experience of the Holocaust, indicated by the types of places and the relationship between those places mentioned in testimonies. Is new data, new knowledge, new understanding, which is valuable to better understanding this period in history.
And even thinking maybe we need a book about interior spaces. Books about camps or ghettos don't explain everything. There's more to know.
Yeah, I really like the idea of using the maps also as our tool as researchers to mine other data or map the data to then do whatever we do with it. Either I may not make a map, I may write about it in another way, but I think that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And last thought, we call it inductive visualization because it's an inductive process.
Thank you. We have another question here, which is a great sign. Rowena, I'm gonna have you. I'll call the meeting to a close, but we've got another question here. How's that? Thank you so much. Thank you. So
it's not even a question, it's just to follow up with the comments. I think that maybe this also contribute to the preservation of historical truth, at least in my case, coming from a historian background in non-democracy. So it's very difficult for us to just tell people the testimony, as I'm a strong believer in the power of narratives. But at the same time, the government basically erased the whole narratives and silence the voices of the people. So I found that even in the presentation of historical truth about the Tiananmen massacre, including the West, people often misunderstood that Tiananmen massacre happened inside Tiananmen Square. And the government immediately said, we only have 3 people now being killed inside Tiananmen Square. So there's no such a thing called the Tiananmen massacre. But if you look at the maps that we prepared, the 2 maps, then the killing happened throughout central Beijing. So I think one map actually tells the whole truth, and you presented that map. And also I like the idea that you mentioned the unnamed places. So the government's narratives is these students are rioters and violent, and that's why we have to crack down. So that's the legitimacy that they rebuilt with that strong narrative throughout patriotic education throughout the whole country. But if you look at those places that I haven't done so, like the unnamed places, people will kill outside their door, people will kill inside their apartment, and students were killed actually when they were far away from Tiananmen Square, heading towards their campus, and the tank ran over them. So I think this kind of mapping actually, I mean, at least in my case, I strongly believe in the power of the narrative, but the younger generation didn't even have access to any of the testimony. But if I can show a map or 2 or name the places, then they would be convinced that, okay, this is what happened. So in terms of the historical truth and power, I think maybe this can contribute as well.
thank you, Rowena. Anna Levy, thank you so much. Thank you. And we'll follow up in February. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.